Reading The Unknown Reality by Jane Roberts, a Seth book, Volume 2. Session 727. Okay, so Seth states, in your terms, the land changes through the ages. Mountains and islands arise, then disappear to re-emerge in new form. The oceans rise and fall also, and in some cases the floor of the ocean becomes the surface of the planet, only to be covered again by water. Yet through all of these changes, the Earth retains a landscape, and at any given time the features of the land are quite dependable and permanent enough for your purposes. So, like the islands that I spoke about in our last session, rose up from beneath the sea. Even as the dialogue of those islands took place, the islands themselves were changing. In somewhat the same way, the psyche sends up counterparts of itself, each with different features or characteristics. As the physical properties of the Earth distribute themselves in a certain given fashion about the surface of the planet, so do the properties of the Earth-tuned psyches distribute themselves. As all physical matter is connected in any particular time or era, so the individual consciousness of each being is also connected with every other. This applies to all consciousnesses as you understand that term. A mountain is composed of many layers of rock that serve, as you think of it, as its foundation. The top of the mountain represents the present you, and the tiers of the rock beneath stand for the past. The mountain itself is not any one of those rock layers that seemingly compose it, however. There is a relationship between the mountain and the strata, but the term quote-unquote mountain is the one that you have applied. In greater terms, the mountain and all of its components exist at once, of course. You can examine the various levels of rock structure. Geologists can tell you when, in terms of time, certain sedimentary deposits formed. The rocks themselves still exist in the geologist's present time, or they could not make such an examination. The mountain would not be a mountain without that quote-unquote foundation. Again, however, it is not any one of those rock layers. Now, in somewhat the same manner, the self that you know is the mountain, and the rock layers forming it are past lives. You are not any one of those past lives, even though they are a part of the history of your being. They are themselves in their own space and time. They exist simultaneously with your own life, even as the strata of rock exists simultaneously with the mountain. Your present existence, however, is highly related to those other levels of selfhood. Now, what happens at the top of the mountain affects all that goes on below, and so everything that you do affects those other realms of selfhood, and there is an interchange that occurs constantly. Physical conditions may be quite different in the valley, in the foothills of the mountain, and at its top. The very climate and vegetation may vary considerably, and yet all life and vegetation within the area are interrelated. Each layer of life that composes the mountain is equally valid and important, and each concentrates upon its own reality at its own level. Like the mountain, therefore, you have a history in terms of the present that is yours, and yet not yours. It does not control you, for you alter it with each thought and action, even as each motion at the mountain's top affects its base. The layers at the bottom, however, are also constantly changing, so that the whole area is a gestalt of relatedness. In the physical world, islands, valleys, plateaus, continents, and oceans all have their place and serve to form the physical basis of your reality. Each blade of grass helps form the life of the earth, so each consciousness, however minute, is indispensable in its place and time. Each flower on a hillside looks out with its own unique vision of the world, and each consciousness does the same thing, fulfilling a position impossible for any other consciousness to fulfill. In terms of time only, there is an archaeological meaning that is hidden within your own nature. To discover it, you look, quote-unquote, down through the levels of your own being, there to find the layers of selfhood that in your world represent the past history of yourself from which you emerged. You are not those selves psychically, however, any more than you are your mother's or your father's in physical terms. You are as different from those reincarnational selves, therefore, as you are from your parents, though you share certain backgrounds and characteristics. It is easy for you to see how you affect your parents in your lifetime, though they are older than you. In the same way, however, you affect your reincarnational family. When it rains, water rushes in great exuberant gushes down the sides of the mountain, bringing life and vitality to all of its parts. In somewhat the same way, your own experiences flowed down and into the cracks and crevices of all the other times and centuries that compose your present lifetime. I have a surprise for you, however, for I have been speaking of you as the top of the mountain, for it certainly seems to you that you are at the top, so to speak. Instead, your vantage point and your focus is such that you cannot turn your head to look higher. Perhaps you are like a fine sunny cliff on the side of the mountain, jutting out, looking down to the valley beneath, not realizing that the mountain itself continues up beyond you. You are then in the position of any of the other levels, quote-unquote, beneath, many also thinking themselves the top of the mountain, looking only downward. You are convinced that you cannot see the future, and this means, in terms of our analogy at least, that you cannot look upward beyond your own time. While this is the case, you will always think of reincarnation as occurring in the past. Think instead of strata of being, each simultaneously occurring. Physically, the human fetus bears a memory of its quote-unquote past. In your terms, it travels through the stages of evolution before attaining its human form. It attains that form, however, because it responds to a future time, a future self not as yet physically created. The fetus itself, before its conception, responds to a self not yet physically apparent, and the future in those terms draws new life from the past, a reality of selfhood, an idea not yet materialized in the unformed future, reaches down into the past and brings that future into realization. The cells are imprinted with physical information in terms of space and time, but those data come from a reality in which space and time are formed. The knowledge of probabilities brings forth present time and reality. Voices spring through the genes and chromosomes that connect the future and the past in a balance that you call the present form. The history of the private psyche and the mass experience of the species again resides in each individual. The archaeology of the past and the future alike is alive within the layers of consciousness that compose your being. In many ways, your language itself has a history that you do not understand. The past is obviously built into words in terms of time. When you speak a given word, you may not know the history of its changes through the years, yet you speak it perfectly. You seldom realize that the present state of your language, whatever it is, will for others someday seem to be an archaic version. In whatever terms, again, you think of yourselves as being at the top of the mountain. In your terms, language presupposes a particular kind of development of mind, and when you think of language, you tie the two together. There are languages that have nothing to do with words or with thoughts as you understand them. Yet some of these communicate in a far more precise fashion. Cellular transmission, for example, is indeed much more precise than any verbal language, communicating data so intricate that all of your languages together would fall far short of matching such complexity. This kind of communication carries information that 1,000 alphabets could not translate. In such a way, one part of the body knows what is happening in every other part, and the body as a whole knows its precise position on the surface of the planet. It is biologically aware of all the other life forms around it to the most minute denominator. This applies to the future as well as to the past. The body itself knows the source of water, for example, and of food. Natives divorced from your technology do very well, as wild animals also do, in probing the life of the planet and their positions within it. A simple tree deals with the nature of probabilities as it thrusts forward into new seeds. Computations go on constantly within it, and that communication involves an inner kind of language innocent of symbols and vowels. The tree knows its present and future history in your terms, but it understands a future that is not preordained. It feels its own power in the present as it constructs that future. In deeper terms, the tree's seeds also realize that there is a future there, a variety of futures toward which they grope. The fetus also understands that it can respond to a stimulus, to any stimulus it chooses, from a variety of probable futures. So do you unconsciously grope toward probable futures that, to one extent or another, beckon you onward. You choose your futures, but you also choose your pasts. There is only so much that I can say, since I am using verbal language that in itself makes a tyrant of time. This book is placed in such a way, however, that if you follow it, an inner language will be initiated. This in itself annihilates your stereotyped concepts and releases you from time's dictatorship. Some of the exercises to be given in this section will be geared to that purpose. An archaeologist or a geologist examining quote-unquote old rock strata will find dead fossils, just as from your viewpoint you will discover quote-unquote dead past lives as you look quote-unquote downward through your psyche. You will seem to view finished reincarnational existences, even as from his present the geologist will discover only inanimate fossils embedded in rock. Those fossils are still alive, however. The geologist is simply not tuned into their life area. So reincarnational lives are still occurring, but they are part of your being. They are not you, and you are not your reincarnational past. To a future self, no more illuminated than you are, you appear dead and lifeless, a dim memory. When you look out into the universe from your viewpoint, it seems as if you look into the past. Scientists tell you that when the light from every distant galaxy reaches you, the galaxy is already dead. In the same way, when you look quote-unquote backward into the psyche, the life you may indistinctly view, the past life, is already vanished. Why is it that your scientists' instruments do not allow them to look into the future instead, into worlds not yet born, since they operate so well in discerning the past? And why is it, with all of your ideas about reincarnation, there is precious little said about future lives? The answer is that your language is limited. Your verbal language, for your biological communication is quite aware of probable future events, and the body constantly maintains itself amid a maze of probabilities. Okay, so the session is over, but there's some really good notes with Seth quotes, so if you want to keep listening. Session note number 1 on the fetus. Rob is saying its astral and reincarnational attributes, its energy, its growth, its perceptions from inside the womb. For all those things, see quotations from the session 503 to 504 in the appendix for the Seth Material, which is not available. So hopefully you guys have that book. And note number 2 is referring to the 683rd session again. Rob says, as Seth told us, quote, all kinds of time, backward and forward, emerge from the basic, unpredictable nature of consciousness and are due to quote-unquote series of significances. Memory operates backward and forward in time, end quote. And then when we get to Appendix 12, it will have more information from this session on present forms responding to a future time. And he says again, go to quotations from the 690th session, Volume 1. I've already given that, so is he. But Seth discussed the ability of our species to precognitively alter the present from the future. And Rob says molecular biology and precognition are also referred to. And then when we get to Appendix 12, there will be a Note 17, wherein biological precognition and the cellular manipulation of probabilities are mentioned. And then also already referenced, but other material related to reprogramming the past can be found in Chapter 14 of The Nature of Personal Reality. And note number 3 is the 684th session from it, Volume 1, already referenced again. Seth came through with one of my favorite statements, he says, even if it is grammatically incorrect. Seth said, quote, "The cells precognate," end quote. And then Rob adds, much of his material in that session applies here. And again, Seth says, quote, "It is truer to say that heredity operates from the future backward into the past," end quote. That's definitely one that has stuck with me. I think about that statement all of the time. And Rob adds that in this playlist, video number 2, session 705, Seth's remark on introducing quote-unquote new genetic information into a damaged cell, a time reversal principle is involved. So if you're just coming in on this video without seeing the first, second, and so forth, so on, definitely want to go back to the beginning. And same with 4 and 5. They're going to link you back to videos from this playlist. So 4 says Rob is suggesting reviewing Seth's excellent material on probabilities, cellular consciousness, the moment point, and related concepts in the 681st session, which he's already mentioned in other sessions, again, prior to this one. You can find that in video number 5, its description. Number 5, Rob is saying Seth delivered much material on language in the 723rd session. So just go back a couple of sessions and you will find that. And I'm skipping 6, going to 7, where Rob states, Seth's material on trees reminded me of his 18th session, January 22, 1964. It made a lasting impression on me. It's full of evocative statements that were new to us at the time, since the sessions were barely underway, where Seth stated, quote, and this is great, by the way, quote, "As to Jane's feeling about trees having a certain kind of consciousness, of course this is the case. The tree is dissociated in one manner. It is in a state of drowsiness on the one hand, and on the other it focuses the usable portion of its energy into being a tree. The inner senses of the tree have a strong affinity with the properties of the earth itself. They feel they're growing as you listen to your heartbeat. They also experience pain, which, while definite, unpleasant, and sometimes agonizing, it is not of an emotional nature in the same way that you might feel pain. It is as if your breath were to be suddenly cut off. A tree knows human beings also by the vibrations in the air as they pass, which hit the tree's trunk from varying distances, and even by such things as voices. The tree does not build up an image of man, but a composite sensation which represents an individual, and the same tree will recognize the same person who passes it by each day." End quote. I really love that. I love trees. We have so many like rare, special varieties of trees in our landscape. I'm not going to read this part, but you guys can. It's Jane's poem on trees. And then I am going to read right here. Rob goes on to state that one might say that Seth continued his own tree data almost 5 years later in the 453rd session, December 4, 1968. Jane presented the rather brief session in full in the appendix for the Seth Material. Again, not available on YouTube at this time. He goes on to say, but from it I'd like to quote these lines. So here we go, we get a little bit. So Seth states, to your way of thinking, some lives are lived in a twinkling in various systems, and others last for centuries. The perception of consciousness is not limited, however. I have told you, for example, that trees have their own consciousness. The consciousness of a tree is not as specifically focused as your own, yet to all intents and purposes the tree is conscious of 50 years before its existence, and 50 years hence. Its sense of identity spontaneously goes beyond the change of its own form. It has no ego to cut the I identification short. Creatures without the compartment of the ego can easily follow their own identity beyond any change of form. End quote. Rob states that the implications within the last sentence are obviously enormous. So, note number 8, when Seth stated in this session, when you look out into the universe from your viewpoint, it seems as if you look into the past. You can find Seth's first delivery for that in the 712th session, with notes 1, 2, and 4 among others. So you just look for that in this particular playlist. And note number 9, I'm not reading the whole thing, but Rob states Seth's point that, quote, there is precious little said about future lives, end quote, is well taken. And then I'm skipping what's stated right underneath that. You can read that, and then I'm just coming down here. And he adds, I've become quite interested in such an achievement in view of my recent but very limited successes in touching upon several personal quote-unquote past involvements. The 2 nameless Roman soldiers and the woman called Mommy. The idea of trying to reach a future self has been with me for some 3.5 years, though, or since I first encountered Nadine, that male personality who inhabits a distant niche in my psychic past. One of the Roman soldiers, Mame and Nadine, are mentioned in Appendix 21. See the excerpts there from the private session for November 18, 1974, as well as Note 1. Then see the comment Seth made the next evening in ESP class, where he states, quote, there are, of course, future memories as well as past ones. As Joseph often says, when you think of reincarnation, you do so in terms of the past lives. You are afraid to consider future lives because then you have to face the death that must be met first in your terms, and so you never think of future lives or how you might benefit from knowing them. End quote by Seth. Next session, sorry about my handwriting, I kind of go fast sometimes, but is going to be about some of that stuff. And Rob labels the next session to be precognition as a stimulus to growth, the varieties of time within 1 year. So all of this is leading up to the Seth's families of consciousness. I just can't wait to read that stuff. I would have just read that only, but I wanted to make sure that it made complete sense, so I had to read the whole book. But anyways, keep watching, looking for next videos, and definitely share